Power Play on this Monday evening. You've seen the warnings by now, the so-called godfathers of artificial intelligence sounding an alarm over how fast technology is evolving and the threat it might pose to democracy, security, and maybe even humanity. Governments around the world are putting their heads together in response, trying to come up with ways to prevent that from happening. This weekend, 18 countries signed an agreement focused on the security angle, how to prevent rogue or bad actors from using AI for dangerous purposes. Canada and the U.S. were two of the countries who signed on to the deal. Jen Easterly is the director of the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and Sammy Curry is the head of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity at the Communications Security Establishment, or CSE. Hello to both of you. Great pleasure to welcome you to studio.
Great to be here.
Mr. Curry, nice to see you again. Ms. Easterly, good to meet you. I'll start with you. I thought maybe it would be helpful for the audience before we get into the solutions proposed, if each of you could reflect on the threat as you see posed by AI.
Yeah.
Ms. Easterly,
so I think we have to understand that AI is a form of information technology, and the short history of information technology is frankly insecurity. And so you think back to the internet, it was never created to be secure. And so ultimately, it's all been about speed to market and features and driving down cost for competition. And really where it's led us is an internet that's full of malware, software that's full of vulnerabilities, social media that's full of misinformation and disinformation. And now this next generation of AI, we have to make sure that it does not have the vulnerabilities that frankly have led to ransomware attacks across all critical infrastructure in businesses large and small, and trillions of dollars lost to global cybercrime. So the stakes are very high when you think about the power and the speed and the unpredictability of these tools. And so it really is significant that governments came together, 18 governments, 23 agencies, along with 20 companies of industry that provided substantive feedback to lay out these guidelines and guardrails.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the guidelines in a second. Mr. Curry, though, I wondered if you could also reflect on the stakes as you see them. How high are they?
The stakes are very high. I mean, there is the risk of misuse of these capabilities if we don't fully understand them. There's also a risk of misuse by cyber threat actors. So it's important that we get it right, and we don't have a lot of time to get it right. So the sign up to the guidelines is super important.
So let me ask you first about the question of time also, Ms. Easterly, because I think on the regulatory side, when we're talking more specifically about the White House or the Canadian government, the conversation that we've had on this program and elsewhere is that the speed with which this technology is evolving is outpacing the government's ability, or in some cases willingness, to be able to regulate it. Do you feel you have time to address the vulnerabilities, or by the time you're at the point where you can have a whole new set being created?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. These capabilities are moving faster than any technology we've ever seen. I will say that having looked at this for decades, we have for the first time actually come together across multiple nations with industry to lay out what right looks like, these secure by design guidelines for design, development, deployment, and operation that can then be actually integrated from a technical perspective into the regulatory regimes that countries around the world are working on. So we're not waiting for the regulation to be drafted. We're actually coming up with the standards that can then be integrated into regulation. The other point I'd say is industry gets how important this is, which is why the substantive feedback that they provided to us, I think they do realize that these capabilities are enormously powerful and that they have to put guardrails in place.
So that's a really interesting comment, and I'll get both of you to weigh in, because what we just witnessed over the past week was the CEO of one of the most famous companies about AI pushed out and then brought back in because of the clash that exists in the industry between those who think they should be going full force, unhinged and unmitigated, and those who feel like safety should be a bigger priority. Are you really convinced the industry is on board with all this?
Working directly with these companies, and again, they provided substantive feedback, and we've been working with them for many months now. I won't weigh in on whatever happened with OpenAI, but at the end of the day, I do think there are very responsible people in these companies that realize the power of these tools and frankly, the risk that could be created if they are not developed as safe and secure as possible. And one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind, Vassy, is the fact that if these capabilities are used in any way that leads to offensive cyber weapons, bioweapons, chemical weapons in a world of terrorism and cyber criminals and rogue nations, there will be an enormous backlash that will then cause regulation that will be extremely strict and frankly could have really negative impacts on the ability to responsibly innovate. So I think it's in everybody's interest to create them safely.
Mr. Curry, I get the argument why it would be in their self-interest, but again, the way I started the segment, what brought AI to so much of our attention at the earliest point was that its founders of the technology were saying, this is going too fast, it is too dangerous. They were not convinced that their own companies were on board with what Ms. Easterly spells out. Are you convinced of that?
I'm as convinced as my colleague Jen is insofar as companies are taking it seriously. And they are signing up to work with us and work with other international partners to bring some order, and the order is in security, to this industry. So the entire life cycle of AI. And I think
but it's not binding. The agreement, like so many others, are not binding.
That's true. These are guidelines, but we hope that what will follow after is that as we prove them, as we build them, as we demonstrate them, that they can be sort of stitched into regulations at some point. But there is a willingness, at least so far, to say, let's work together.
Ms. Easterly, last question to you. I think so much of this sounds very technical, I think even to myself. I'm wondering if you can impart on Canadians watching tonight what a scenario you're trying to stop looks like. Like what is it in tangible layman's terms that you're trying to prevent from happening?
Yeah. So you have to think of AI as just a form of software. And we know that software was never created to be safe and secure. It's why we have ransomware attacks. It's why we have data theft. It's why we have disruptions on things like pipelines. It's why our energy grids are vulnerable. So you can think about AI as the most powerful technology frankly, that we've ever seen being used by nefarious actors to use them for offensive cyber purposes to destroy our critical infrastructure, our water systems, our energy systems, our financial systems. You can think about using them to create biological weapons, chemical weapons. So we really need to ensure that governments and industry are working together to mitigate the risk of these capabilities being used for nefarious purposes.
Okay, on that note, I'll leave it. I appreciate both of you making time for the discussion. Thanks so much to Sammy Curry, the head of the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity at CSE, and Jen Easterly, the director of the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Coming up next.